Of the many monarchs England has had, perhaps none are more infamous than King John. Brother of the Lionheart and heir to the Angevin Empire, his failures, perceived or real, puts him in the shadow of what is considered to be a time of glory for Anglo-Norman kingship. Following the great territorial expansion and prudent administration of his father, King Henry II, and the romantic warriorship of his crusading brother, King Richard I. John is seen as a failure, both relative to his close predecessors and to all that came before him and after him. Few monarchs have acquired such a contemptible reputation. He, of course, lost the first set of crown jewels, was pushed out of most of France in a string of defeats to King Philip Augustus, taxed his subjects beyond reasonable measure,
Taxes! Taxes! Beautiful, lovely taxes!
and wielded power like a tyrant, provoking rebellion amongst his barons, and the drafting of the Magna Carta. Such a reputation inspired stories like Robin Hood, a vigilante figure who fights against an oppressive government to the betterment of common folk. But do these grievances properly reflect the reality of his reign? His rule was certainly a turbulent time, but could it have instead been down to a mixture of bad luck and insurmountable factors out of his control that stacked up against him? This video discusses this very issue, arguing that whilst he committed certain acts of personal tyranny, harsh taxation, continental blunders, and practices of intrusive rule, much of it was brought onto his doorstep from events abroad or from factors dating to before his reign over England. John was the youngest of Henry II's 8 children, of which 4 older brothers were in line to inherit the throne before him. William was the eldest, but he tragically died in 1156 at the age of 3. Next was Prince Henry, who ruled as a co-ruler alongside his father, but also died before he could succeed Henry II in 1183. With those 2 brothers dying before Henry II could pass the throne, John still wasn't in line, as the next at this point was Richard. Richard ruled for 10 years, from 1189 and 1199. He famously spent only 6 months actually in England, the rest on the Third Crusade, in captivity in Germany, or defending his French territories from King Philip of France. Richard's reign was cut short after an arrow wound to the shoulder got infected, and John finally had his chance. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 27th of May 1199, finally becoming king. But, to rewind for a moment, much of these French territories Richard sought to hold against Philip consisted of Aquitaine, this large landmass here. This became part of King Henry II's domain when, on the 8th of May 1152, he married Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine. Under Henry, this land was granted to Richard, and similar territorial partitions among his sons took place. Prince Henry, the imperial heir after William's death, was given inheritance rights of Anjou, the king's ancestral home, Normandy, Touraine, and England. Geoffrey, who was the 4th-born son, received Brittany through marriage to the heiress Constance. But in terms of the duchies John received, he got nothing. He was made Lord of Ireland in 1177, but quickly made a mess of things in 1185. He also got a sprinkling of castles across England and the Norman county of Mortain. This is how John got his nickname of Lackland. Despite such meagre holdings, John was Henry's favourite, and he stood by his father in 1173, when his mother and 3 of his brothers, Prince Henry, Prince Richard, and Prince Geoffrey, revolted against the king over anger over these territorial arrangements. By the time King Henry died and Richard became king, John had not had an ordinary share of power as a prince when compared to his brothers, which may have contributed to his future ineptitude as king. He lacked administrative experience and became king after a milieu of familial conflict and the failed potential reigns of his elder brothers. When John had the crown placed on his head in 1199, he had to contend with a whole heap of problems produced during his family's previous sittings in power. Most glaringly, the Angevin treasury had been emptied during King Richard's reign, first to fund the transcontinental Third Crusade, then to pay off the ransom needed to free Richard from his captivity in the Holy Roman Empire, and then, once again, to wage war against France. These events left John penniless when he inherited his brother's conflict with the King of France, Philip II Augustus. This war with France began whilst Richard was away on crusade, and Philip desired to break up the Angevins' vast territory, which was greater than what the actual King of France controlled at the time. Under Richard, the Angevins were able to hold on to their territory in a back and forth in which Philip remained at bay and the overall conflict was a stalemate. In Normandy, the King of England would construct an enormous castle, Chateau Guillard, for defence. This provides some context for John's famously rapacious extraction of taxation money from his subjects. He had no money and had to contend with a very talented enemy in Philip, so he had to get it somehow. Despite the over-extraction of taxes, the Angevins under John saw defeat after defeat. Chateau Guillard was put under siege for 6 months, from August 1203 to March the 6th, 1204. King John led a relief effort, planning to lead a 2-pronged attack on the French army, combining a naval and a ground force. But the relief effort failed. Poor winds and tides caused the naval force to arrive too late, and the army was defeated as the French regrouped. This defeat doesn't actually seem like John's fault. He came up with a pretty complex plan that failed, at least in part because of factors entirely out of his control, like the weather. However, his actions following the defeat of his forces shifted his reputation in the conflict from rotten luck to personal embarrassment. John rode away from the front, without informing his commanders, and fleeing back to England. The only person to blame for this abandonment is John. A clear act of cowardice, he sheepishly crept away from his forces, leaving the garrison of Chateau Guillard to be forced to surrender to Philip's army. Whilst the war itself and the failure to relieve Chateau Guillard were ostensibly not John's fault, he shows a failure of leadership and personal courage by leaving, suggesting that whilst John was given a very poor hand to play with, he worsened his own situation because of his moral character and personal conduct. Financial war and ruin was not all that John inherited from his family's rule. Historians David Crouch, James Holt, and Ralph Turner all describe a sort of Angevin fatigue held by English magnates because of the dynasty's heavy-handedness and harsh practices of rule. The dynasty pressed increasingly excessive demands on these magnates. Henry II, for example, was notorious in having a hand in the murder of Thomas Beckett.
Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?
As the story goes, was a slipping of the tongue and probably not what Henry intended, but the sentiments of many in the church soured towards the Angevins, angered at Henry's approach to enforcing royal authority on the church. Richard fueled the fire by imposing deep financial burdens on the realm, whilst himself being absent. Then there is John. According to Turner, John received the culmination of this anger as it came to head under his reign. As in the previous examples discussed, the king did little to remedy the conditions brought on by his predecessors. He continued to exercise the same control and brought on harsh punishments for disobedience, and notoriously treated prisoners poorly. The case of William de Broise, for example. King John railed against him for failing to pay his debts of 5,000 marks and rent for the city of Limerick to John. This is a valid complaint against a subject, as they seemingly failed to uphold their end of a contract between magnate and ruler. But once again, John made the situation worse through his own conduct. In response to the debt, John seized all of William's assets and starved his wife and son to death. This helped to cement John's reputation as a tyrant, as he wielded his power to dish out very harsh punishments on his subjects. John inherited the anger of his people and made it worse by continuing the same heavy-handedness as before, whilst also failing militarily and administratively, areas his predecessors saw much more success in. Was King John really that bad? Is what I was originally going to call this video, and the short answer is probably no. If that bad means as bad as what pop culture and the man's reputation suggests. When he ascended to the throne, which was never meant for him, he inherited angry nobles, an empty treasury, and a war with France. It was a set of challenges that any monarch would find a handful, and John should have been excused for general failure, as he had deeply unfavourable circumstances forced upon him by forces out of his control. However, as explored through numerous examples, John's bad luck was not helped by the weakness of his personal character. He showed himself to be a bit of a coward, and an overzealous punisher and enforcer of laws on his magnates. He made his own bad luck worse, and cemented his reputation as a rubbish king. If his ruling methods were more benign, John could have gone down as overseeing a reign that was a financial and military failure, but was led by a stable ruler who was the victim of circumstance, and not a tyrant obsessed with tax and his own authority.